It's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you our speaker this afternoon. Dr. Michelle Brown is one of the most distinguished scholars in all of medieval studies and manuscript studies in the entire world. She is in fact the reigning expert in medieval Latin manuscripts. She was for a number of years curator of the collection at the British Library. She worked also for the University of London, where she still is an assistant or at least a visiting professor. She was also working at the University of London for many years and is now a professor emeritus of the University College of the University of London. Most importantly for our purposes, she is a professor also, a visiting professor at Baylor University, and we're very grateful that she has agreed to be amongst us on a regular basis. Some of you may have remembered that she came here last year and gave a wonderful lecture, and she is also during the week, for those of you who are interested in manuscripts, she is upstairs in the Ballou Scholars Room every afternoon at this time for the balance of this week, conducting manuscript workshops. So that if you are interested in Latin manuscripts and you're willing to learn something, she'll be happy to teach you, and there's nobody better. I want to mention that she is the author of many, many, many books. She doesn't confess to authoring the ones that appear under a pseudonym, but she has to confess to the ones on which her name appears. And so I want to mention two of them, different ones than sometimes I have mentioned in regard to her. One of them was in connection with an exhibit at the Smithsonian Institute in DC, and Dr. Philip Jenkins, who some of you may know, says it's the best single exhibit he has ever visited. He produced this book called In the Beginning, Bibles Before the Year 1000. It's a splendid book, and if you haven't seen it, I recommend that you trot over to the library, get out the copy, and spend a little time with it. It's splendidly produced, wonderfully scholarly, terrific illustrations. Most recently, she has produced, well, not most recently, I can't keep up with her, but the most recent one I have read is called The Book and the Transformation of Britain, 550 to 1050. And those of you who are interested in British manuscripts, British manuscript tradition, and the relationship between orality and literacy and visual literacy in this culture, there is no better book. I have read it with tremendous pleasure, and as you can see, I've done it in my usual fashion. I've got little post-it notes everywhere, pages that I think I have to return to. Dr. Brown is an extraordinary scholar. It's a pleasure to have her here with us at Baylor. Welcome, Dr. Brown.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Byron. Thank you all for having me. It's lovely to be back. And I've got the luxury today of speaking to you about some of my recent research in St. Catherine's Sinai, but looking at that in the context of how the churches of the Near East and those of the Far West interacted in the early stages of their development. And of course, Christianity is a Middle Eastern religion. Yet so much of its history has been played out recently in the West that it can sometimes seem like a Western faith tradition. And communities of Christians in the eastern and southern parts of the Mediterranean struggling today for existence can sometimes seem rather remote to us, although of course with our current state of world affairs, the presence and the threat to many of those communities and to their Christian heritage is of great imminence to us. I'm going to embark upon treacherous seas now, because many a frail bark of scholarly reputation has floundered on the rocks of perceived Eastern influence. However, for about a century now, various scholars have commented on components within the new Christian cultures of the archipelago of islands of Great Britain and Ireland in the early Christian period that have a marked Eastern resonance. The liturgist Edmund Bishop, for example, in his article Spanish Symptoms, looked at the possible Iberian roots for some of the Eastern devotional and liturgical traditions that we find within some of the Western material. Historians of art, such as Françoise Henry and Hilary Richardson, have delved into some of the stylistic and formal relationships. And my own mentor, the great paleographer Julian Brown, talked about the North African elements of the late antique legacy within insular codicology and paleography. However, many of these instances have been disjointed notices of individual occurrences, and they tend to have been viewed either as cultural parallelism, sheer historical coincidence, or secondary and tertiary influences, as I say, mediated via Gaul and Iberia. What I want to look at today is a bit of a roundup of some of the historical, literary, and art historical and artifactual evidence to see what that amounts to, and to also use some of my own recent research in the Sinai to see if we can also talk meaningfully about prima facie contact between areas who in the first centuries of Christianity had an intertwined relationship as Christianity spread eastwards towards India and westwards to what was then the parameter of the known world. So, come with me on the journey and let's see what you make of it. Now the journey is halting at the cursor. Come on. Oh, come on. Sorry, it was all working. That's it, that's better. Okay, now this is a thing called the AngloSaxon World Map. It occurs in a manuscript made in Canterbury around about the 1020s, a thing called the Anglo-Saxon Scientific Miscellany. And this is the first of the surviving medieval map monde. And it represents a conflation of the residue of the Greco-Roman tradition of cartography and voyages, meeting those of the Viking trading empire, of which Britain formed a part under Canute from 1016. And so at the bottom, can you see is my cursor appearing on there? This is it's not a Mercator projection, obviously. This is Great Britain. These are the Orkneys, the Shetlands, the Faroes. Here we've got Iceland, and here Ireland and the Isle of Man. And if you look at that and the details surrounding Scandinavia, you can see quite readily the Viking exploratory elements coming in here. Of course, if we were to go a little further, we'd have Vinland as well. Jerusalem, of course, towards the centre of the earth here, the Garden of Eden at the top. Here we've got the Nile Delta and the Red Sea. And the superimposed lines represent the itinerary of the Archbishop of Canterbury at the beginning of the 11th century in his journeys to visit some of the holy places. And it's literally sort of turn right at Amiens, and you'll get a really good night's B&B with the abbot of Seven Romani, etc. So that's the way that works. And it's partly based on Ptolemy and the Cosmos Indioplastes map, but as I say, with new influences coming to bear. And so I think it's an appropriate place to start our journey into thinking about how the Anglo-Saxons and Celts perceived themselves in relation to that broader picture with Jerusalem very much at its centre. Now, Christianity probably first reached our islands, where I now reside, in the very first centuries of Christianity. And of course, it would have embraced the faith as a state religion in the 4th century after Constantine had been proclaimed emperor in York. And his mother, of course, is alleged to have been of British origin. Now, you'll be pleased to know that after the crash of the superpower in the course of the 5th century, that the olive oil and wine carried on flowing on the western seaboard of the British Isles, and also Southern Ireland, which, although it hadn't been part formerly of the Roman Empire, we're now finding more and more archaeological evidence of them trading effectively, and we've even found North African DNA amongst some of the burials on the southeast coast from the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries. Places such as Tintagel, that you see here, renowned for its later Arthurian associations, was thought for a long time to be an early Christian monastery. It's now been shown to have been a Roman and post-Roman offshore banking and trading centre. less romantic, but interesting nonetheless. And you see some of the insulae here. St. Michael's Mount, near where I now live in Cornwall, has an interesting history of initially being a Bronze Age manufacturing centre that then became a Phoenician and a Roman trading centre before becoming an early Christian eremitic monastery. And at the time of the Norman conquest, because of its similarity to Mont Saint-Michel, it was gifted to that Norman establishment, and the Augustinian monastery that you see on the top was then constructed. It's interesting at an age when we work so much through things like the Disaster Emergency Committee, Oxfam and others to try and marshal aid for other parts of the world, to note that in 610, the Patriarch of Alexandria, John, in his Vitae, is engaged in raising funds for famine relief in Cornwall on the back of the age-old tin trade between Western Britain and the Mediterranean that had fueled the European Bronze Age. Thinking about the high places, the ultimate high place, of course, is Mount Horeb, adjacent to Mount Sinai, where Moses encountered the Lord in the burning bush and received the tablets of the law. And it became, of course, a goal for early pilgrims. From the time that renowned amateur archaeologist, Helena, the allegedly British mother of Constantine, first discovered the true cross and visited sites such as this, stimulating others to make the journey. We have an account, for example, by a Spanish woman who we think was probably a nun, Etheria or Egeria, who visited Sinai in the 4th century. Now, she's always been a great heroine of mine, and I went back and reread the passage of her visit recently and noted with a little dismay that she said, of course, this was the hardest part of my whole journey around the Holy Land, because it was the only place they couldn't carry my litter, and I had to actually walk myself. But nonetheless, quite a remarkable thing, a journey for a woman to have accomplished at that time. And she certainly, as we will see, was not alone. Now, this isn't Paula. It's a Greco-Egyptian mummy mask, but it's, you can look into that woman's eyes and just see that intelligence and commitment. So I like to think of her as a cipher for Paula. Now, Paula was a renowned Roman socialite and matron turned ascetic and Christian scholar, who left her giddy whirl of society in Rome, gave away her worldly goods to the poor, and having initially embarked upon the monastic life in Rome, then went to join Jerome in Bethlehem and assisted him in his editorial and translating endeavours next to that little cell, next to the Church of the Nativity. And Jerome himself, we think, was responsible for the epitaph on her tomb in Jerusalem, and he writes to her daughter in 404, commending her for her journey to the Holy Land and the life of the ascetic scholar that we all seek to emulate, that she embarked upon there. And she's one of a number of people, as I say. We're going to encounter another Roman matron, Rusticiana, who I think had a formative influence upon Gregory the Great, and I'm going to tell you about some of my new research relating to him and his involvement in Sinai, which has previously really gone unnoticed. Now, we know that we think we know that there were a number of pilgrimages from these islands to the Middle East. However, the examples that we have been considered by some scholars, notably the very fine academic Tom O'Loughlin, as a mere literary topos. A mere literary topos? No, that's unfair, but as a literary topos. However, I think there's more substance, as we'll see, to it than that. One example that springs to mind is that of the Frankish bishop Arculf, who in the 680s was returning from a pilgrimage to Judea and Egypt, who comes out of the Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar in heavy weather, and instead of turning right and going up the Channel to France, ends up going into the perilous Celtic Sea, past my house at Land's End, and finds himself spending Christmas on Iona with Columba's successor, Ad of Narn, where they spend a jolly time recording his experiences, and he even draws ground plans of the holy places upon wax tablets for Avignon, who writes up the account into De Locis Sanctis, the holy places, which is subsequently reworked by Bede, the greatest scholar of the early Western world, who writes something that can be used for centuries as a practical pilgrimage guide for those undertaking the physical journey, but also as a spiritual journey for those who, like he himself, never travelled more than 30 or 40 miles from their place of birth. Another example is that of the West Saxon monk Willibald, who in the 780s spent his retirement dictating his accounts of his exploits in the Middle East to the nun Hugeberg of Heidenheim. And he recounts his journeys in the 720s or 730s and includes his reference to his time at the monastery of Marsaba, outside of Bethlehem, where at the same time he's visiting, St. John Damascene is writing the Fount of Knowledge, a refutation of heresies, which includes the earliest Christian account of Islam, which is treated as a Christian heresy. So we see an Anglo-Saxon coming into direct contact with some of the very earliest Western cognizance of contemporary events in the Middle East. There are also chance references to possible visits in the other direction. For example, an Ogham stone adjacent to a holy well in County Tipperary, just into County Cork, at Agabulo, refers to Olin the Egyptian. Whilst at Temple Brecon on the Aran Islands, off of the coast, west coast of Ireland near Galway, we have a gravestone to the Seven Romani. Now you've got to be careful how you deal with epigraphic evidence of that sort, because Olin the Egyptian could well be a good Irishman who's adopted the Eastern eremitic vocation of the Desert Fathers in Egyptian fashion, thinking of the phrase in the Antiphony of Bangor from the north of Ireland that talks about this house full of delight, namely the church in Ireland, is built on the rock and indeed the true vine, transplanted out of Egypt. And the Seven Romani could well have been Seven Romani travelling to what was one of the greatest theological seminaries of its day in Ireland, or could be 7 local lads who had adopted the Roman rite, recalling that as early as 431, the Pope had sent Palladius as a bishop to those who already followed a Christian way of life and worship in Ireland. Okay. So we've got to be careful about these things, but we do have some examples there that are well structured and conveyed in a literary sense. We also have figures such as St. Wilfrid of York, who is one of a number of young men who visited Italy and Gaul and decided, having been so impacted by what they encountered, to rebuild Rome on English soil. And here we see one of the 2 crypts that he constructed, this one at Ripon, which are designed to be based on the Holy Sepulchre, and which contained the relics and other materials that he brought back on his travels. And when he died in 709, the focus of his cult there was a purple codex, the sort of thing that Jerome had criticised, saying, if only the people who paid for such things would read the message of the gospel and actually enact its words, rather than spending their money on visible signs of patronage and consumption of wealth, this Christianity might get somewhere. The Christian in me applauds it. The manuscript curator is still quite glad to have purple codices. Such is life. But of course, the Brescia Codex, which it stands as a cipher, we don't have Wilfrid's own volume, was probably something that he'd acquired on his many travels in the continent. And of course, it's very, very different to the homegrown vernacular response produced within the next decade on Holy Island in the Lindisfarne Gospels, which we'll touch on again shortly. And when we look at these purple codices, spot the difference. This one from Syria, this one from Constantinople, this one probably made by the nuns of Minster in Thanet in Kent in the 720s, 730s. So we can see how they're situating themselves not only within what we think of as a sort of Hiberno-Saxon style of the Book of Kells, but how there's this strong impetus to actually ally yourself with the broader theatre of Christian material culture. And when we look at this beautiful book, the Royal Bible, which is made in Canterbury probably in the 830s or 40s, when the Vikings are already at the cat flap of England and coming into Kent, and things are about to change big time, you can see that in one respect, although you've got lettering which is adorned with contemporary Truiddle-style metalwork of the sort sported by the well-dressed man about town on the streets of Canterbury that very year, you can see that the whole rhetoric is couched in terms of an Italo-Byzantine apse with the word enshrined upon the high altar, with the Christ Pantocrator figure here finding its close analogy at Sant'Apollinare in Classe in Ravenna, for example, as does the symbol of St. Luke here, and a Codex Purpureus again. So this pervades right through the insular period. And I think it's interesting that we're talking now about the Byzantine aspect here. Now, those of you who've known anything about the history of the insular church will know that the way in which it's traditionally represented is that the conversion of the pagan Anglo-Saxon Germanic settlers who had carved numerous petty fiefdoms out of what had been the Roman Britain, the scenario that we get is that their conversion was conducted by the newly converted of Ireland, converted by Palladius, by Patrick and others, by bishops from Gaul, but notably by the Roman mission launched by Gregory the Great in 596, which arrived headed by Augustine in Canterbury in 597. There's a pincer movement. The usual story is that they find that they've got differences as well as things in common. Bede, in his little picture poem, summons up the fact that they look different. The Roman camp have the corona, the crown of thorns, for their tonsure, which some of you gentlemen are sporting very fetchingly today, whilst the Celts, or rather the Columban Church, does something far more punk and shaves the forehead and has a great flowing mane of hair, which may be a continuation of earlier Druidic practice. Many Druids, we think, now converted and became priests quite early on. The other thing, of course, is bank holiday trading and those sort of issues, in that the two parties adhered to different calculations for the dating of Easter. So the King of Northumbria and his Kentish wife couldn't celebrate the feast at the same time because they were at different points in the celebration of the liturgical year. And so the idea is that Hild is in charge of a great summit meeting in Whitby in 664, at which the King of Northumbria gets to decide which way he's going to jump. And Bede again says, well, he decided that much as he admires Columba and the Irish saints, when he gets to the pearly gates, it's going to be St. Peter holding the keys, and he's not going to upset him, is he? A vote for globalization rather than a local church for local people and a local kingdom restricted to trading and interacting in its own backyard. Okay? But there's a bigger picture here. We're not talking about Celtic versus Roman in the way in which this is normally represented. We're talking about the Columban Church, the missionary endeavour instigated by St. Columba's peregrinatio after he'd caused the biggest bloodbath in Irish history, having evoked a charge of plagiarism and breach of IPR in 563. Many other parts of Ireland are observing the Roman Rite from, as I say, 431 onwards. And we're talking not about Rome, we're talking about a much bigger picture. The Bishop of Rome at this point is one of a number of patriarchs who's busy emphasising his primacy and his authority in the West on the basis of the rock that is Peter, but it's not a done deal at this point in time. Okay? And I want to just unpack for you a little bit more of the complexity of that situation and how that relates to our situation. The big deal at the Synod of Whitby is the perpetuation of the Paschal controversy, which had kicked off at Nicaea in 325. still rumbling on. Add to that the complexity of the monothelite situation, which led to Pope Martin I being assassinated in Rome in 655, and you have a soil in which potential schism in the West is ringing all sorts of alarm bells, because you don't want to end up with the sort of situations that you're having to be worked through in the East. Okay? That's point one. Just after Whitby, a new Archbishop of Canterbury is appointed. And if you need any evidence of people travelling from east to west, think about that new Archbishop. Theodore of Tarsus, from Paul's hometown. The most educated man of the Eastern Mediterranean at that point, who's thought to have trained at Antioch in Syria. He's appointed by a Syriac pope. And the second half of the 7th century and up to the 730s, there were 5 Syriac popes. Okay? In the 670s, the Syrian population in Rome was so numerous that the Syrian pope expelled them to prevent bloodshed. You didn't have to go all the way to Syria to encounter Syrian Christianity. Okay? Think about that wonderful Santa Maria Antica in the Forum, decorated with those wonderful frescoes in Syriac style at the beginning of the 8th century for Pope John, for example. Okay, the whole thing is far more complex and nuanced than we think. Now, Theodore brings with him, as his right-hand man, Abbot Hadrian, latterly an abbot in Naples. And he, of course, we now think is a Berber from North Africa. So this is a truly cosmopolitan church in England at this time. And the school that they establish in Canterbury is now thought to have taught Greek, as well as Latin, as well as the English vernacular. Okay. Now, one of the things that Theodore does in 679 is to convene, if you like, the G8 summit equivalent of the tryout for the Great Sixth Ecumenical Council to be held in Constantinople in 681, and that's held a few miles north of London. This is no mere provincial outpost on the edge of the known world. This is a place that's participating in absolute centrality. And John the Archcantor, who's the head of the papal capella, is sent to ensure that at Hatfield, the English church subscribes to the orthodoxy of Chalcedon and supports the idea, as it states at that conference, that Christ has a human will as well as a divine will. A refutation of the monothelite stance. Okay? And John hasn't just come to teach chant. He goes to Monk Wearmouth Jarrow and teaches Bede and others to sing. But he's here really to ensure the whole orthodoxy and the adherence to this. Okay? So we're actually participating in much bigger issues that focus upon Constantinople. And the issue here is about international, ecumenical adherence to orthodoxy. Yeah? Okay. The need to reinforce the idea of the integral nature of the human and divine will spills over into art. Here we've got the earliest dated illuminated manuscript, which is the Rabbula Gospels from Syria, made at Beth Zagba in 586. And you'll note here that the crucifixion has the Stephaton and Longinus detail, which is picked up and much beloved in Irish art and apocryphal texts. And here we have the Durham Gospels, dating to around about 700 from either probably Melrose or Lindisfarne, a Columban book. And you can see that the drapery style here is very much like contemporary Coptic textiles, depictions of figures, and very Eastern style angels. And here you've got Stephaton and Longinus. And this very literal illustration of the crucifixion, I think, may be in response to another of the Eastern council's dictates, the Council in Trullo in 697, which outlaws the traditional iconography of St. John the Baptist as the precursor and advocates use of the crucifixion in its stead. So insular art and culture tied in to the cutting edge of this contemporary international debate. And the reason that, if you like, the iconographies of the crucifixion and the Virgin are taken up so much around this time, and the insular world being foremost in the West in taking this on under Eastern influence, is because the conception and the nativity are, if you like, the moment of the implementation of the human will of Christ, and the crucifixion are the moment at which, because Christ is incorrupt, he cannot conflict with the divine will, and therefore his human will obeys the divine will by offering himself up as a servant even unto death on the cross. Okay? So this is cutting-edge theology. When we look at the depiction of the Virgin and Child in the Book of Kells, which was possibly made on Iona around about 800, we can see that the image is not conveyed in the full frontal stance of the Byzantine tradition, but the sidewards stance of the Coptic Church. And you've even got here a misunderstood detail. The lozenge-shaped brooch that the Virgin is wearing is a rather prudish misunderstanding of an exposed breast for suckling that you find, for example, in the church of Der al-Syriani in the Wadi Natrun. Okay, and note also the liturgical flabella used for keeping flies off of the Eucharist in the East, and Columba's cult is said to have had a relic that was such a flabellum. But the overall style of pose is what we call the Coptic pose. And of course, when the Christian Copts moved into the ancient pharaonic temples, they didn't stop to redecorate. They rebranded a lot of the imagery that they saw there. And so Isis and Horus becomes the Virgin and Child. The weighing of the souls by Thoth becomes St. Michael and the weighing of the souls at the Last Judgment, a sort of synthetic acculturation of the sort that we're going to see shortly within the insular context as well. Now, I think that when we look at the way in which the evangelists are portrayed in the Lindisfarne Gospels, which I would place on Holy Island, manufactured in around 715 to 720 on the basis of certain lections and the role that it plays in elevating St. Cuthbert as a model for a newly reconciled, integrated insular church, that we've got certain things going on here. Now, when the book was first referred to by Strutt in the late 18th century, its figure style was referred to as monstrous and barbarous. Didn't quite accord with the ideas of the grand tour and the classicism that was in favour at that time. But these are actually set down like Eastern icons on the page, and they're drawn in two dimensions because they are essentially sacred figura that help you to penetrate deeper into the mystery of text. Now, art historians have noted that there are two beardies and two clean-shaven evangelists. Now, the beardies are normally said, oh, well, they've copied Byzantine models, such as the 9th century example, post-iconoclast example that we see here. Whereas the clean-shaven ones, such as John, have copied Roman models. Now, nothing at this period is quite so incidental as that. It's the result of a lot of deep theological pondering. And I think what we have here is a neat visual summary in diptych form of the insular church's adherence to the orthodoxy of Chalcedon. The two beardies are those who symbolise Christ's incarnation and his mortality. Matthew symbolised by the man because his gospel deals with the incarnation, and Luke, who deals with the crucifixion and the sacrificial victim, the calf or bull. Those are the two beardies, aging, mortal, perishable, human. Whilst the two who are shown as clean-shaven, perpetually youthful and divine are Mark, the Lion of Judah, kingship and resurrection, and John the Visionary, whose eagle flies directly to the throne of God for inspiration, and who is depicted as Christ in majesty, enthroned at the second coming with the scroll of the Book of Life. So a neat visual statement of the integral nature, the four Gospels working in harmony to show that union of the two natures. And polished with a dog's tooth, the pink background, to resemble Coptic encaustic wax icons of the age. Now, interestingly enough, in 681, the year of the Great Ecumenical Council, Benedict Biscop founds the second of his two great monastic establishments, the twin foundation of Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow, at which Bede conducted his studies. And Jarrow is founded in 681, and Bede describes them as two places with but one will. Again, another built statement of that integral nature of the two wills, looking always towards Constantinople and the East. And when we look at something like the Great Codex Amiatinus, that was one of the three great Bibles produced there before the abbot of Wearmouth Jarrow, Ceolfrith, went on retirement to Rome in 716, taking this book with him as a present for the Pope, we can see something of this mindset. This book subsequently had its dedication inscription from Ceolfrith erased, and the name of a local Italian saint put in its stead. And it was not until the 1880s that it was recognised as English rather than Italo-Byzantine work. So convincing is its unsealed script, its late antique illusionistic style of decoration, and most importantly, its text, which when the Catholic Church came to decide upon the recension that was going to be used for the first printed edition of the Vulgate, at the Council of Trent, the scholars who were assembled as a result of that decision looked at the available manuscript copies, and the version that they found that had the closest authenticity to Jerome's 4th century work conducted in Bethlehem and Caesarea was the Codex Amiatinus and the Lindisfarne Gospels for the Gospel section as well. Remarkable that they've fallen heir to that whole process of editorial scholarship of the late Roman world. And they're picking up very much the mantle of Cassiodorus, who of course retires from public life, not wishing to work with the heretical Ostrogoths, and founds the vivarium on his country estates, dedicated to accurate study, editing, copying and dissemination of scripture. And this image in the Codex Amiatinus, at one level, is a figural narrative representation of Ezra the scribe, who is thought to have recovered the Hebrew scriptures from memory after they'd been burnt by the Babylonians around 600 BC, but who is also a cipher for Cassiodorus, whose 9-volume edition of the Bible, the Novem Codeces, one of 3 editions that he prepared, is shown in the armarium. But if you look at the spines, these are Augustine, Origen, Jerome, and the various editorial voices. And so this figure is also Ceolfrith, Bede, who would have been one of the leading scholars and scribes engaged in the production of these 3 great authoritative statements about the canonization of text, prepared as reliable exemplars and fueling the ideas that Alcuin then transplants into the Carolingian Empire with the Tironian Bibles of how you publish well-researched text. It's also an open invitation to all of us who look on that image now to be part of that ongoing process of transmission. And as we'll see, this is part of a way of looking at texts, so I might as well rehearse it now, which goes back ultimately to commentators such as Jerome, and also to the monastic father John Cassian, one of the desert fathers, who founds the island of Lorraine off of the south coast of France, at which St. Patrick is said to have trained, who teaches that there is a literal meaning of the thing, and Bede quotes this almost verbatim. There's a literal meaning, which is the history, and then there's the allegorical meaning that gets you deeper into the layers of the onion and deeper into the possible multivalent meanings of the text. And then there's anagogue, which takes you into the divine mysteries that lie beyond that process of penetration. And then there's tropology, which gives you the moral interpretation and the practical application. And that is also related to the Kabbalistic use of something known as the Pardes. Now, we don't know whether the Christian tradition is influenced by the Kabbalistic or vice versa, but there's certainly, I think, quite a strong association there. And some of our most complex early Christian examples of the application of these principles are found in some of these insular images and in the accompanying exegesis of commentators such as Bede. Now, the Lindisfarne Gospels, if you like, represents more of the vernacularization, if you like, of this whole process. And so when we look here, we can see bits of Byzantine silks being woven into our ingredients. We've got all of the semiotics that people who've signified who they are, what they believe, by the ink on their arms, by the jewelry on their bodies and their weaponry for centuries, all now put at the service of the ultimate word of God. And so here, for example, to represent our fourfold harmony of the Gospels, we have not only the sort of square Roman capitals that will be seen on the epigraphy that littered the landscape still in the north of England, but we have things like this letter that looks like a 4-bar gate, which is a Celtic ogham letter form. We've got the stylized angular forms of Germanic runes used in divination, and elsewhere we've got Greek letter forms. So again, the idea of a fourfold harmony of different traditions worldwide feeding into that process of transmission. And if we look here at the little procession of birds on Monday morning, not looking where they're going, heading straight for the mouth of the cat who's already swallowed a little procession of them, we think about the intertextuality that is implicit in this approach, where not only can you summon up centuries of association through the ornament, but by the simple expedient of introducing naturalistic animal forms, as opposed to the style 2 Germanic ornament that we see on contemporary metalwork, such as this from Sutton Hoo, where everything looks like the progeny of an elephant and a vacuum cleaner. We can see that by introducing the cat, you've immediately, in the minds of those who have filled their inner library with things needful to know, would know from the Alexandrian text of the Physiologus that the cat represents the threat of evil waiting to pounce on the unwary. But also, as a good Celt, Dr. Jeffrey, you'll know also that it's the Celtic Cerberus, Crutna, who's the guardian of the entrance to the other world. So immediately the possible outreach in your community of reading is extended. When we look at things like Sutton Hoo and think about the person who was buried there around the 620s, who has buried with him not only ancestral heirlooms from Scandinavia, but Coptic tableware, beautiful silver, possibly Christian, when is a cross a cross and when is it a cross, from Byzantium, but more distinctively his christening spoons, perhaps, Saulos and Paulos on these 2 Byzantine spoons, recording again the passage in Bede where it says that the pagan King Redvald of East Anglia was compelled by his godfather, literally in every sense of the word, Ethelbert of Kent, newly converted at the nagging of his wife Bertha from Gaul and St. Augustine, to come to Canterbury and be baptized. And when he got home, he took his christening gifts and put them in the temple alongside everything else. Reminds me of visiting a wealthy widow in Tokyo who told me very proudly that she was Christian because she'd been brought up in a convent, but that of course she was going to be buried as a Buddhist, as all good Japanese were, but meantime she was observing Shintoism. And it's perfectly normal. The Prittlewell hoard, found recently near Southend. Again, Coptic military saints such as Menas depicted here. And when we think of the person who was buried there and the way in which he or those burying him depicted his place on the world stage by having all of this array of material imported from the Rhineland, from Scandinavia, from Byzantium, from the Silk Route, from Gaul, all of those things coming together to proclaim his place in the world. The great gospel books, such as the Lindisfarne Gospels, do something similar when they take different ingredients. And it's a bit like Chinese-Jewish fusion cooking. It's how do you identify those ingredients which immediately summon up in the mind a distinctive culture and then combine them in a new recipe that actually has this underlying purpose of stressing international ecumenical orthodoxy. Yeah? And so when you came and dragged your granny 300 miles to your miracle of healing, seeing something there that reminded you that your Celtic heritage was part of it, or that your Germanic heritage with the animal ornament was part of it, made you feel part of that big picture that would then be unpacked for you, I guess, by some sort of mediator, in the same way as when you go and look at the Book of Kells in TCD, you have your audio guides and your visual display panels to help you undertake that journey. Okay, I am going to go on past the hour, so be warned. If you have to jump ship, that's fine, but I do hope you won't. The Lindisfarne Gospels is made, although it's one of the most complicated books of the day, by one single artist scribe. And he's working very much within the Eastern Eremitic tradition of the Desert Fathers, who would undertake the copying of a gospel book or a psalter single-handedly as a Lenten exercise. St. Melania the Younger, Lydia of Thessaloniki, women also participating in this. Columba and his friend St. Kenneth won acclaim as hero scribes by undertaking that solitary feat in which the scribe takes up the pen and preaches in the desert of the book. Now that is very much an Eastern phenomenon that you only find echoed within the Eremitic tradition, which is one strand of the monasticism of the insular world. And when we look at places such as Skellig Michael and the little huts that cling like gulls' eggs to the side of this island in the Atlantic, we find the closest analogies, of course, are in the adobe huts of places like the monastery of St. Anthony's on the banks of the Red Sea. And when we look at the iconography of Paul and Anthony, the hermits who meet in the desert to be fed by the raven with the Eucharist, we find that cropping up time and time again on Pictish and Irish sculptures. Here you've got the two of them seated in eastern rows with date palms between them on a piece from around 800 from Fowlis Wester in Pickland. And the great Staffordshire hoard of 7th century military artifacts that was found recently in Mercia includes this interesting piece, a Christian piece, which is a quote on two sides from Numbers 10:35, and it's the cry of the Israelites in the wilderness. O Lord, disperse our enemies from thy face, with the brazen serpent seen in plan like roadkill inscribed on the end here. And this, of course, is the prayer that St. Anthony and after him Guthlac and Dunstan used to fight off distracting demons. Now, to the wilderness itself. This is the monastery of St. Catherine Sinai in the middle of the desert, and this is Mount Horeb that Moses ascended. Now, a number of hermits had taken refuge here during the persecutions of the 3rd century onwards. It was a good way of husbands and wives, for example, getting away from one another. You would go into the desert to escape the persecutions and say, there's a nice cave over there, and there's a nice one there. I'll see you on Sunday for joint worship. And this sort of, if you like, loose affiliation of hermitages is brought together under Justinian in the middle of the 6th century when he fortifies the monastery. And that's not incidental, of course, it controls the great Nabatean trade routes that go right through the Wadi. And until the 1920s, it was a mile long, full of palms, and it was cleared for charcoal, deforested for charcoal in the 20s. So you can see what an important place it was in the Sinai. It's the only life-giving support that you have there. Can you notice these archaeological remains outside the walls? Now, fact being stranger than fiction and the power of history, these are the barrack blocks of the Gebelai. The Gebelai are the only Bedouin tribe who are allowed to work inside the monastery. And that's because they claim descent from the military cohorts of auxiliaries from Transylvania and the Carpathian Mountains who were posted there by Justinian to protect and serve the monastery initially. When Sinai became too dangerous for the military and the police to patrol, and bear in mind there were 39 soldiers killed on the checkpoints a couple of weeks ago in the Sinai, the Gebelai stepped up to the mark and manned the borders, saying, Justinian told us to protect Katerine, the safety of one of the most volatile places on the planet being secured by 6th century orders from Constantinople. More of the Gebelai anon. Here we see Archbishop Damianus during the Easter liturgy with candles and incense honouring the icons. And this is the cutting from the burning bush that now stands at the eastern end of the basilica where prayers are pushed into the stones. And we'll ignore the rather dubious theology of the fire extinguisher so that if the Almighty should come again, he can be extinguished quickly. This is the interior of Justinian's basilica, where the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th century icons are still revered and used as part of the liturgy. And this is one of the most beautiful of them, the 6th century icon of the Pantocrator, painted in hot wax here. But it is, of course, a fortress, and its history during the Crusades becomes quite an interesting one. And I think the reluctance to accept any direct contact between the West and the East, between the demise of the Roman Empire in the West and the Crusades, is partly because of the rhetoric of crusade, which still pervades our contemporary news reports. And the historiography says that we shouldn't expect to find any Western presence or influence there until the Crusades. Now, of course, some of those who've challenged that were the famous Sisters of Sinai, Mrs. Lewis and Mrs. Gibson, who camped in the monastery garden for 6 months and had the monks bring them out materials to start the first catalogue. They then took their findings, that and the Cairo Geniza, back to Solomon Schechter at Cambridge, who promptly started working on their work. But there you go. And this is the little room that they paid for within the monastery that was designed to be a reading room for future academics visiting the site, which is now the Archbishop's parlour. And the librarian who you see sitting next to him is a good Texas lad whose family have studied here at Baylor. This is Father Justin, who thankfully is wonderfully computer literate, and we're doing great works, a number of us there with him. Jeff's a very good personal friend of his. Now, you can either ascend the mountain via the gentler camel route, or you can climb the 3,000 steps of repentance, which I was allowed to do for time off on Sunday afternoons, having taken part in the liturgy every day, which starts at 3 a.m. They roll up a lot of the divine office into one chunk because it gets so hot. So from 3 until 8:30, you're standing in the church for a lot of the divine office. Then you go into the library until 1, 20 minutes to eat, back in the library till 3, in the church until 5, back into the library until 9, then off to the women's room to write up your stuff. Women have to be out of the monastery at 9 because apparently that's when we become dangerous. Hey, we're always dangerous. Now, the steps of repentance are, of course, used by John Climacus as the basis of his ladder of ascent, which, of course, the game of snakes and ladders is based on. We go up a couple of steps and back 10 as the serpents and demons tempt us back. More of that anon. At the top, you would be greeted by the mummified effigy of one of the early monks who would hear your confession before you then went on to the Plain of the Elders, which is a remarkable place where there were a number of early monastic sketes where you could be walled up for a while in something like this. While I was there, one Sunday afternoon, wanting something else to do, I said, I've heard about Father Moses. Can I know a bit about him? They said, well, we don't talk about him because he has visions. I said, well, we expect our hermits to have visions within the Western tradition. Can I visit him? All right then. So we climbed another mountain range opposite. And can you see the trees on that little ledge? That's Father Moses' cell. Now, Father Moses' vision is that he's created a fair trade social justice network for the women and children Bedouin of Sinai to work themselves out of the abject poverty that they live in. And when he isn't doing that, he shares the bottled water that his brethren send him up with the gardens that he's formed on the terraces that feed he and his little Bedouin flock with almonds, peaches. It's amazing. He's a little octogenarian mountain goat of a man, full of energy and good humour. He's very Cuthbertine in his approach to society and to faith. Anyway, that's very much a spiritual heart. You might also be interested to know that at the very heart of the monastery there's a mosque next to Justinian's basilica. Now that was built by the monks in the 9th century because the Fatimids had hard-lined at that point, and the Gebelai who were living in their blocks outside had to convert to Islam. Okay, and so the monks built them a mosque so that they could go about their worship during their daily working lives. The monks, however, were given right to dwell in a document that purports to have been issued by Muhammad, which is probably a later 7th century construction, but early. And basically it says that the monks had right to dwell unimpeded, and we hope that's still recognised now because things are getting pretty hot out there for Sinai, and we've seen from Mosul and other places how things that we think can never be taken from us can be. So it's something we have to be so aware of. But the document also said that anybody visiting St. Catherine's had unimpeded right of passage throughout Islamic territory. So anybody visiting the Holy Land would have to go to St. Catherine's in order to be able to visit the other holy places. So it becomes an incredible meeting place at the heart of the wilderness. And of the 3,000 or so books that remain from its library, we have a remarkable cross-section of Greek texts, of Arabic texts, bearing in mind from the 7th century, Arabic was the first language of many people in that part of the world. And we have Greek-Arabic bilinguals, we have Georgian manuscripts, we have Glagolitic from Macedonia, etc. The thing we're not supposed to have is anything in Latin from the West. Now, E.A. Lowe had commented on one thing that was thought to be a later introduction that had come in with the Crusaders. I didn't buy this. When I did the Smithsonian exhibition in 2006, in addition to borrowing the new portion of Codex Sinaiticus, which had been found at the monastery in 1975, when a little room that had been locked since the 18th century and bricked up was discovered, a bit like a geniza, other things were discovered. And I was pretty sure there were Latin things there, and so I borrowed some of those too. And sure enough, one of them had been miscatalogued as Slavonic, because they hadn't expected to find anything Latin. So on the back of that, they let me go for a month to see what I could find. And so far, I'm at 50 early Latin manuscripts and rising, most of them fragmentary, some of them full volumes. And together, they rewrite what we know of East-West interaction during that early medieval period. When we look at something like the 10th century lectionary of Mount Horeb and look at the way in which Sasanian ornament is used for the animal ornament of the standard usage of the monastery, we find again that the Book of Kells looks to similar sources for some of its material. Look at the distinctive rightward slant that you get on a lot of the Greek texts, for example, from Sinai, and you can see the Semitic influences coming into the paleography. The codicology is basically a Syriac and Greek matrix, okay? Georgian, Glagolitic, responding some of them to Byzantine centrality, but of course recognizing that the early churches of the Christian Orient and their relatives had no problem with using their own languages, their own script types, and their own decorative styles, because these were ancient churches that had developed their own communities early on. And of course, under Islam, community religious leaders were synonymous, and so this helps to reinforce the idea of local churches having their own local identities. And this is something that's picked up on in the far west. You won't get that in Carolingia. One of the reasons that the vernacular Italian, French and German are so late to develop in written form is that a superpower such as the Carolingian Empire tries to suppress wherever possible local cultural manifestations of that sort. So you have things like Caroline Minuscule promulgated as a one-stop shop throughout the empire. You can get the same form of N in Trier as you can in Trieste. Yeah. Now, looking at the Latin material that survives, this Psalter, for example, it's probably 10th century, couldn't have been produced in a Western scriptorium, I don't think. I certainly haven't found anything to parallel it. If you look at the general layout and the codicology, it's Greek, and you've got a Byzantine headpiece and Byzantine style initial here. If we had time to get into the intricacies of the script, you would see a fusion of Merovingian, Lombardic, Visigothic and insular paleographical forms combined. Now, you don't get that in Western scriptoria. Now, the plot thickens. Gregory the Great and his involvement in Sinai. Gregory wrote to John Climacus, praising the devotional tradition of Sinai, its use of icons, etc., and lamenting that he couldn't leave the sinking hulk of the church in the West and become a monk at Sinai himself. Again, this isn't generally known, but it's there in his epistles. And I think one of the ways he's got to know about it is that his key patroness is the granddaughter of Boethius, Rusticiana, of the Anisi family, who's funding a lot of his charitable endeavours in Rome. Now, Rome isn't a very pleasant place to be in Gregory's time, and so, unlike Paula, Rusticiana hotfoots it to the Byzantine court and is having a lovely time. When she isn't there, she's going on pilgrimage to Sinai. And she goes there a number of times with her daughter, who's married into the Appian family, who are the governors of Egypt, going for a miracle of healing so that she can conceive. And Rusticiana writes to him, telling him about their sojourns at Sinai. And Gregory, I found from the archives at the St. Catherine's End, which complement the little that we know from the Western End, endows a monastery within a monastery. He endows 15 places, even down to the mattresses and the clothing to be worn. And these may well have been for Westerners, I think, within the monastery. Basically, the tradition there is that monks from different traditions form little monastic cells within the community and start producing manuscripts in their own tradition or importing them from outside to carry on their liturgies within the monastery. And I think the same is going on with the Latinate tradition, but we just didn't know this previously. Now, this is what I call my Sinai sandwich. This is one of the palimpsests. Now, skins are at a premium in the middle of the Sinai, and some of them are palimpsested as many as 5 times. And only now, with digital imaging and multispectral enhancement techniques, can we really begin to get to the bottom of some of them. Here you can see Arabic in the blue on the top with Greek in the lime green underneath, for example. And what we have here is a manuscript that was made up by a Christian Arabic scribe within the Sinai community around about 900. And what he's doing basically is palimpsesting earlier fragments and sewing them together like a patchwork quilt to make pages. Now you'll note, the underlying level, the lowest or earliest level in some of this archaeology of these fragments, is 6th century Greek biblical material from Sinai. Okay? That's palimpsested by 2 Italian hands writing in uncial and half uncial of the Rome of Gregory the Great. And at the time that Gregory is sending Augustine to Canterbury in 597, he's sending legates to Sinai. So things will be coming in and out from Sinai on the back of that. Can you see, for example, that beautiful M? Where are we? There. Yeah? Got that? And the N underneath. Right, so this is Latin mixed uncial and half uncial letter forms. And basically this is the Vulgate Apocalypse that's being written by this hand. Okay? The plot thickens. In addition to our 2 Italian hands who are palimpsesting, we also have, this hand. Can you see at the fold, there's a line of script that hasn't been written over? There, yeah? So, Kebant, B-A-N-T, that's the Turonian shorthand for enim that the Irish particularly like using. Non, in, da, festo. Okay, and up here you've got an initial E in red and a line of display script. Erat, capital A, flat-headed T, Tironian hooked H for autem, erat autem, P-A-S-C-H-A. Erat autem pascha, what's that? Opening of the Passion narrative in Mark 14. And the closest analogy for that style of insular minuscule script occurs in the Moor Bede, which was made at Monk Wearmouth Jarrow in the 740s and includes the earliest English poetry, Caedmon's hymn, recorded by Bede. Okay. And the style of the display script and the initials find its closest analogy in Mercian works of the second half of the 8th century from central England. This creature, for example, is a senmerv. It's got a very Egyptian-style pointed beaked bird's head and a wing on its back. It's got a quadruped's front paws that it's stretching out to be the cross stroke of the E, and it's got a fish's tail. Now that's a senmerv, which is a Persian beast, which signifies the coming together of the different elements, the trimoda necessitas of Christian theology. And it finds its closest analogies on things like this ewer from Iran, and in this little book that was made for a female physician from Worcester or thereabouts on the Welsh border around about 800. Other of the Latin materials from Sinai. This is a missal, which is written in a rather odd form of pre-Caroline minuscule and uncials of vaguely Merovingian but not precisely Merovingian type. Could just about be an import, but I think probably more likely to have been made at the monastery. This, I think, is a copy at the monastery of something that conflates Lombardic Beneventan forms and the distinctive dot-dash abbreviation system of Visigothic here. Okay, so you've got, again, this mix and match from different early Western script tradition. This, again, another one I think that was made at the monastery. It's basically based on Luxoi minuscule from the Irish foundation of Columbanus in the south of France. But when you look at the way in which this B is misunderstood in Beata and the open-topped A, etc., you get the impression of a scribe who is copying something from another script system, but not entirely on top of what some of these rather odd letter forms are actually doing. This one a little bit more convincing as a 7th or early 8th century Merovingian manuscript in terms of its decoration, but the script is actually Caroline minuscule, so you've got a mismatch in periods there. So again, I would argue a local Sinai product. This one definitely is local Sinai. A lot of them have that very distinctive rightward Semitic slant, almost a boustrophodon, where one line goes in one direction and the next goes in the other, almost as if you're used to writing along the lines that way. So all of these together, I think, evidence that things are being imported as models, people are coming in, as I think I've hoped I've demonstrated. You've either got with my Sinai sandwich to say it was written in Sinai in the 6th century, went to Rome around 600, went to Anglo-Saxon England where it stayed in the 8th century and then came back to Sinai for 900, in which case you've got to account for that journey anyway. It's much more logical to think that those personnel were working in Sinai, yeah? Which lends credence to the literary topoi of pilgrim visits and things. Going on from that, we've got good Caroline minuscule with alphabets, etc., tried out in other of the languages represented at the monastery. This again is a local Sinite scribe copying Caroline. This is interesting. This is an early example of Carolingian pneumatic notation, but I think, again, with the slant, written at Sinai, and note that it's ruled in pencil, which only really starts being used in the West around about 1100 for this sort of pricking and ruling generally. And the other big giveaway is, of course, some of them are on paper. You're not going to get that in the West before the 11th, 12th at the very earliest, yeah? And in Northern Europe, not until the 13th, 14th. Okay. It carries on. This is a proto-Gothic 12th century Latin script with an earlier Caroline minuscule and pneumatic chant represented here when you should have stave lines now from Guido of Arezzo normally, and again on paper. Okay. And they seem to be very preoccupied with music and chant. There's a big tradition of chant within the orthodoxy at the monastery, and they're obviously very interested in Western chant traditions. Again, I think this is another local one from the 13th century that again is picking up on different influences. That, I think, is an import. That's a pretty good English hand of around about 1200. Again, lots of Gothic material, but now we're into the Crusades and it becomes more explicable. This is a piece of canon law produced, I think probably actually copied at the monastery rather than from Bologna or Avignon. And I've even found in the archives the Archbishop of Sinai issuing documents in papal style, as if he's the Pope, in Latin. Now, part of this is showing, I hope, how many pilgrims there must have been going through to need so many liturgical manuscripts to service them throughout these intervening centuries. This is interesting. This is the earliest surviving letter of safe conduct for a pilgrim, and it dates to the very beginning of the 14th century. And it's issued, note here, by the Bishop of Drogheda in Ireland, and it's recommending Bill the Builder, Willielmus, an Irish mason, and saying, he'll do a really good job for you, Archbishop, but I want him back safely afterwards. And here we have a document referring to the dastardly deeds of the merchants of Genoa and Ancona and others who, again, aren't supposed to have had any dealings with the Sinai, but very evidently were. And of course, the Doge is well in there. And right up to the 17th, 18th century, the archives are showing this web of diplomacy that we had no knowledge of from the Western end, or that had been concealed or lost, including Ferdinand and Isabella patronising the monastery, Mary Tudor and her Spanish husband Philip, all sorts of interest being represented there. And of course the monks have managed to survive over the centuries by balancing their diplomatic network and having a balance of interest converging upon the wilderness that give them continued right to dwell, not only there, but to safeguard their land holdings in places such as Cyprus and other strategic centres. So returning to our Italian hands, very briefly, and Gregory the Great, at the time that he's writing to John Climacus and praising the use of icons such as this, he writes to Serenus of Marseille, who's busy knocking the heads off of statues, and says, "Woe, mate, in images the illiterate read," thereby opening the door for the history of art in the West and figural narrative, under the direct influence, I would suggest, of Sinai. And so when we look at the books that Augustine brought to Canterbury with him and their relationship to things like the great portals of Santa Sabina with their figural narratives, we can see where Gregory is getting some of this from. When we look at this whalebone casket made perhaps to contain a royal genealogy in Northumbria in the early 8th century, we have scenes that include the Romulus and Remus suckled by the she-wolf, the sack of the temple in Jerusalem by Titus, the Germanic hero Wayland the Smith about to rape his enemy's daughter and conceive a hero, juxtaposed with the Magi and the Virgin and Child. So a synthesis of world history leading up to the revelation of the Christian present, labelled in Roman capitals and Germanic runes. When we look at something like the Temptation in the Book of Kells, we can see the deployment of the idea of anagogue, allegory, and tropology, because this is not only literally a symbol of the illustration of the temptation with the Syrian devil tempting Christ off of an Irish-looking house shrine as the temple. It's a schematic figura of the communion of saints, with the church triumphant already in heaven, the church militant, the disciples doing the work on earth, and the church expectant, awaiting liberation, presided over by Osiris, god of the dead, depicted with his crossed flails in the manner of the stelae of the Egyptians. And again, we can find him posing as St. Luke in the Lichfield Gospels from the mid-8th century. There's a great deal of exoticism in Mercia at the end of the 8th and beginning of the 9th century. The Bredon angel and the newly discovered Lichfield angels have just landed from Constantinople, and they have their damp drapery and their bouffant Hellenistic hairstyles to prove it, modelled on things such as this portable ivory from Constantinople. The walls of the Mercian monastery of Bredon and the Hill around 800 were adorned with Syrian lion hunts, centaurs, harvesters in the vineyard of the true vine, etc. And in 773, King Offa of Mercia, at his royal centre of Tamworth, had a gold mancus struck based on one that was minted that same year for the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur in Baghdad. And you can see that he has his own name placed next to that of Allah above in Kufic script. The Book of Kells, again, has Kufic elements, stylized Kufic elements in some of its decoration, and pieces of Kufic script have been discovered in archaeological contexts in Ireland. I'm about to end. And this arabesque is a classic Islamic motif. The little symbol of the man in the Book of Durrow from the 7th century from Iona is not only an Anglo-Saxon belt buckle on legs. I think he's consciously referencing the Eastern vestments that we find in Armenian manuscripts, such as this priest gospel from the Waters. And of course the newly discovered Garima Gospels, which has been radiocarbon dated and proves that I was right all those years ago when I said it's an original early work, because most of these Ethiopic things are later copies that are thought to depend on earlier lost exemplars. It's now been radiocarbon dated to plus or minus 600. And its evangelist images provide the best analogies for things such as the evangelists in the Irish pocket gospel books that will be taken out into the field, which you see one on the right from the 8th century. Pictish slabs, such as this Abelemno, again, close analogies in things like the Armenian Khachkars, and are similarly positioned to mark boundaries and places of embarkation on journeys. The Northumbrian name stones, such as this of the woman Osgith on Holy Island around 800, are modelled upon Coptic pillow stones. Coptic carpet pages underlie the designs of things like the Lindisfarne Gospels, but again, something different going on here. They're described as carpet pages because art historians thought they looked like Persian rugs. I found references in Bede and elsewhere that we actually used prayer mats, the oratorio, as part of the liturgy of Good Friday in England at that time, falling heir to the liturgies of the Eastern churches that Islam also inherits in things like the use of the prayer mat at the entry onto holy ground of prayer. And each of the carpets in Lindisfarne having a different cross. The Latin cross, the Greek cross, the Coptic come Celtic ringhead, and the Ethiopic tau. So different traditions again feeding into that fourfold harmony. The use of aniconic solutions, such as carpet pages and display script, honouring the word of the divine, picked up later in the 14th century in Islam, but explored much earlier by people such as the maker of the Lindisfarne Gospels. And the idea of having sacred monograms, because you don't write the name of the Almighty out in full because it is too sacred, inherited from the practice of the Jewish sofer, the scribe of scripture as a priestly calling, as Bede describes his own work. Okay, about to finish. A couple of other last little instances. This is the Cahach or Battle of Columba, possibly the book that he was accused of plagiarizing, which was enshrined and carried into battle by its hereditary keepers in Armenian fashion to ensure victory in just war. Books that don't open, the earliest canonical version of the four Gospels, the Freer Gospels, which in the 7th century was turned into a book that could no longer open, and the images of the evangelists carrying their treasure bindings with their own individual acts of witness within the liturgy, becoming the visual signifier when the text could no longer be accessed, is something that's paralleled, for example, in this Irish book shrine of around 800. The gospel book contained within was never designed to be seen again. It had become a relic, and its efficacy came through the presence of the text within and its association with the saint who had used it. In the 850s, it was torn apart by a disgruntled Viking raider who threw it into the lake because all it contained was an old book. The idea of carrying the hidden scriptures in procession to assure authority over the land that you went through, modelled very much on the idea of the ark and the concealment within. This is the depiction of the tabernacle and the temple in the Codex Amiatinus, probably designed by Bede working from Cassiodorus in around about 700. And there's even evidence that Anglo-Saxons wore phylacteries, tefillin. You can see here in the early 14th century Holcomb Bible that even after the Jews had been expelled so that the English government didn't have to honour the national debt, that this artist is still trading with them on the continent and shows them wearing the badge of Judaism, which in England was the phylactery. Around the 780s, Alcuin writes back from Charlemagne's court to the Archbishop of Canterbury saying, please stop the English wearing scriptures from John on their foreheads to cure headaches. Again, mantling the Torah, feeding into the idea of treasure bindings, the earliest of which are from Coptic Egypt, the Harmontis treasure, and Constantinople, the Sion treasure, from about 600, picked up rapidly in Irish book shrines, and also the Armenian-style book satchels that are increasingly being found in insular archaeological contexts. The Armenian practice of redeeming books as hostages, found in this mid-8th century manuscript from Kent, which in the mid-9th century was redeemed by Ealdorman Alfred of Surrey and his wife Werber from Vikings who'd taken it because of its perceived bullion value, and gave it to the altar of Christ Church, Canterbury, for the good of their souls. Now that was a way in Armenia of getting really good brownie points for the soul, as was the idea of entering extensive colophons, naming makers and patrons in your books, which is picked up again in the insular orbit in things like the Lindisfarne Gospels. And when Aldred has his colophon in the 950s and his interlinear translation that makes the Lindisfarne Gospels the earliest surviving copy of the Gospels in English, he's citing himself in an Eastern tradition of using your own language to share Godspell, Old English, good news, a process that Bede was engaged in much earlier on his deathbed in 735 when he was translating John, the little gospel that speaks of the things that work of love, to share with his fellow country people in their own language, working in an Eastern tradition and acknowledging himself the generosity of the Jews in sharing scripture with the Gentiles through the Greek translation of the Septuagint. And finally, when our maker of the Lindisfarne Gospels creates this blue, he's not able to get lapis lazuli from the foothills of the Himalayas. But as I found when I conducted this Raman laser non-destructive analysis of the pigments, he fakes it, he knows about it, he values its exoticism, and he makes it by boiling up the local woad plant and suspending crystals of hoof and horn gum to give the surface appearance of ground lapis rock. The earliest lapis used in the West is in books from Wessex, and by that time, the early 10th century, Alfred the Great has left alms to India in his will. So perhaps some of the trade routes had opened up a bit. And when we think about our scribe in the desert of the book on this little island off of Holy Island on the north coast of England, making the Lindisfarne Gospels and thinking about the words of Cassiodorus, that every word written is a wound on Satan's body, and the scribe preaches with the pen and unleashes tongues with the fingers, and that Cumian of Iona, that when you read, you ruminate and meditate on text, which gives you that glimpse of revelatio, which is the transformative moment when you see yourself in the bigger picture, not only relating horizontally to Constantinople, but vertically to eternity. That's the pregnant moment of possibility that transforms the world, and in which that desert culture feeds into changing society. So when Cuthbert, in whose honour the Lindisfarne Gospels is made, is elected bishop, rather than Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, going off to Lambeth Palace, imagine if he'd gone under canvas in the peace camp protest camps in Parliament Square. That's what Cuthbert does. He becomes a hermit just outside the king's bedroom window. And every time the king and his people look out, they hear the words conveyed by Bede and the maker of the Lindisfarne Gospels, Eadfrith, that Cuthbert said that even if I could build a cell with walls so high, all I could see was the sky, I'd still be afraid the love of money and the cares of the world would snatch me away. There are responsibilities that come with power. And he's saying this to a nominally Christian person who's engaged in genocide of fellow Christians for political expansionism, the political realist. No, this is not the way you do things. And so that idea of the vulnerable, emaciated, Gandhi-like figure of the indomitable holy man fasting for justice at your gates in accordance with Irish law is something very powerful and what we still see today. And it could lead kings to be assassinated by their bodyguards for freeing slaves and forgiving their enemies It could lead hardened warriors brought up in the mead hall on the genealogies of their military forebears to become pacifists. And at the time that things like this are going on, the monks of Iona get the first law on the Irish statute books, the law of innocence, protecting women and children and non-combatants in warfare. We could do with that in Gaza and Syria today. So this is all tied up with transforming the world, with social justice and walking the walk, as well as talking the talk and writing the word. And this is something that's been moulded partly by that desert experience. Just to finish, this is the Book of the High Altar in Cornwall, Petrock, made in Brittany in the 9th century and used to record the freeing of slaves. The book as a place of public assembly and enactment of social justice from around 900 onwards, even in our little part of Cornwall. And the images in that book are based on things from Brittany. Do their evangelist symbols look a little odd to you? Do they look like a different culture? They're the only ones that have got a fully human body and then an animal's head stuck on the top. Does that remind us of anything? Egypt. And if we look at Coptic images from a similar period, you can see that their evangelists are sometimes handled similarly. Now, is this just cultural parallelism? One of the other things I've found at the monastery end is that in the 9th century, the monks of Sinai themselves promote the cult of St. Catherine as a donor cultivation program. And they send out monks with the begging bowls, and the areas that they target are Brittany, Normandy, Anglo-Saxon England, Trier, and Cologne. The lands next to Landerveneck, the abbey at which books such as the one that came to Cornwall were made, are owned by Sinai. So perhaps our interesting cultural parallelism of things that look similar are the result of face-to-face contact. And when we think of the cult of St. Cuthbert, with his incorrupt body placed in 698 in this wooden coffin adorned with Isis and Horus, the Virgin and Child, the saints, the angels, and a little book of St. John's Gospel pasted inside it, bound in Coptic technical fashion, recalling the idea of Coptic books that are pasted inside the coffin, the idea of the Christian Book of Life replacing the Egyptian Book of the Dead in the journey into eternity. And we think about that painted coffin of St. Cuthbert's that still survives in Durham and its analogies with late Egyptian and Coptic painted coffins. Replace Osiris, Horus and the Shabti figures with the saints and angels, and you've got St. Cuthbert's cult. And at exactly this time, you've got incorrupt bishops being buried in their vestments in tombs that, like Lenin's tomb, were supposed to be regularly open so you could see the incorrupt saint inside. It's an Egyptian cult burial that we have in Northumbria with Cuthbert. Just to seal the thing, Henri Pirenne, the great economic historian, who says that the Islamic expansions cut off things like papyrus exportation from the southern Mediterranean to the rest of Europe, and uses that as a key example of the disruption of contact between the two worlds. This is a little psalter from Ireland round about 800, discovered in a peat bog at Fadden Moor a couple of years ago. Its binding is made of cartonnage of papyrus, and nearby is an Armenian book satchel. Only in the insular world around about 800 could we have had an image such as this from Bredon on the Hill, where we have a Byzantine-style iconostasis screen separating the chancel from the nave with images of the saints and the Virgin depicted in the Eastern iconographic tradition of the Virgin Hodegetria, the indicator of the way. Only in the insular world, however, with their perception of the book moulded by the world vision that they have, would the Virgin point to the Codex as the incarnation of the divine. Thank you.
It's past 5, and you'll have chances to ask questions at the workshops upstairs. Each afternoon at 3:30 to 5, where Dr. Brown will be available to you both to teach and to deal with questions. But I think
we're going to do paleography from antiquity to the Renaissance in 4 afternoons. Come with me.